So when you're getting into a product operations role and there's a million things that you could be doing, how do you prioritize and sequence, and how do you get started and make and be successful in your role?
Yeah, I mean, I pull an awful lot from user research as like a really important thing to just understand what you're trying to do, right? And so I think the first thing that I did was try to meet with pretty much every one of the product managers in this very large organization, and then meet with all of the other function leaders that were, you know, partners to ours. And then same thing in our case, because we do consulting, trying to meet with all the different like vertical leaders that deal with like healthcare or finance or something like that to understand really what are the problems that are happening, not only from our own self-perception of the community, right? Like what are the problems we deal with as trying to do product management? And some of those that are Cognizant are things like, we're not actually sold as product managers when we go on a client. Like we're actually like user story writers or scrum masters or something like that, which is much more focused on, you know, the project managing side of the world. But then looking at the other side, it's like, you know, talking to salespeople, talking to function leaders. They don't understand actually what product management does, because product management is a fairly new practice within Cognizant. And so seeing that as understanding how all these different things link together started to create kind of this, I guess like a cyclical flow type of diagram or a causal diagram that says, here's the problems that lead to other problems, right? So we look at it from the standpoint of a complex system, and then we say, where can we start to experiment with interventions? And this comes from like using things like complexity theory from Dave Snowden and Cynefin, starts to get into this world of like, how do I now like make little tweaks here? And did that tweak have the effect I wanted? Did it amplify the behavior I wanted, or did it cause something else that I didn't want? And so I think a very strong amount of like user research to understand and your community. I think it also builds trust with your community, by the way. Like the more costly signals that you give while talking with your community, the better, because they know that you're there for them. The next thing is like, how do you then form hypotheses that are usually focusing on complex systems? And then how do you experiment and start to understand when you should amp up or stop an experiment? And so I think these are all things that like great product managers do anyways, right? It's just that it's like very specifically about our community. And so that's what I did when I first got started. It was like my 30, 60, 90 days, trying to make, you know, basically understand 30 days, start some like hypotheses within 60 days and some early experiments, and then 90 days trying to like have something that turned from an experiment to a success. And so that's kind of the way I would look at 30, 60, 90.
Right. It's good. Really good approach. I want to add on to that a couple. So if you think about it, the way we think about product operations, really think about you're a product manager, right? You're product manager for, you can call it a process or cadence is how team work, right? So let's just using process. It sounds like a bad word, it's not, right? Every computer runs on processes. So we have a processor. So let's just be that. So product manager, a product operations, it really is a product manager for processes, which means how your product team operate internally with each other and cross-functionally and with executive and stakeholders. Now, if you think about that, you build a roadmap based on outcomes. So you have like the Chris mentioned, right? So what kind of outcomes and problems you try to solve, use that, you build your own roadmap, and then doing user research, which is similar, right? So it's really a product management mindset. But I also want to highlight is there are two likelihood of product operations that are introduced. One is a house on fire. We have so many problems. You throw and say, hey, we need someone to solve the problem. So you know the problem. You go put something on it and kind of stop the bleeding, stop the fire, and then you figure out the broader thing. Sometimes it's a preemptive. People know, okay, I've been in this role before. We know we're going to scale. We know we're going to have this role come in because I know if I have this role, it's going to be amazing. So then you come in, you need to do a lot more to say, what is the first problem we're trying to solve? You create a roadmap to give you there. So, but I totally agree with you, Chris, in that way, is that, product operations is a product manager. Your product is how you design how the team work together, really being community, being process, being, prioritization, whatever, roadmapping, it is you, but you're not the decision, right? So you have to work with a lot of stakeholders to say, what is the outcome we want to solve now? What is the outcome we want to solve next month or so on? So I think that's what it is. And if you're throwing a house on fire, go stop the fire and do something else. If you come in that say, we foresee this is coming, then don't bring something, say, I used this before, I'm gonna just drop here. It won't work. no matter how experienced, like exactly, it's just not. So you bring what you learned, bring the what's behind the learning, and then learn a new organization again and see how much is really applicable and how much you do need to adjust it. And then ultimately you need to bring the people along, right?
Yeah, and I was just in like it's
right.
I was just in a session earlier today with a bunch of people that are like safety professionals, like people that work on oil rigs and OSHA inspections and stuff like that. And we were talking about rituals that are used in those cases, right? And a ritual that I remember from a bunch of different times, like at Microsoft or Facebook, like is this idea of signing off on a spec. And so back 20 years ago, we would actually print out the spec and have everybody sign it. But now we have someone like type their name in a box. And we were just talking about this idea of like rituals from the standpoint of like why we do these things and what does make a good ritual. And so I've been thinking an awful lot too, just recently about what are the unsaid rituals that we end up doing, right? Like, yeah, sure, there's like agile ceremonies, right? Like that we end up usually including in the way that we do our work, like planning, review, and retro. But I think maybe making these things more apparent or written down for when new people come into an organization, they need to adopt to the culture that's there.
Right.
And so part of product operations is not only to like understand what are these rituals that are happening and to modify them in some way, right? If it's beneficial.
Right.
But also then be kind of the welcoming party for new product managers that are coming into the org. So that, yeah, so basically like people can be way more effective, way faster, right? And so, I don't know, I really love this idea of rituals as well. I almost want to call like processes rituals going forward. Because it kind of includes the kind of like weirdness and uncertainty of it as well, rather than just this idea of a set of steps or a checklist, right?
Yeah, I think that's the thing where actually, I think it's a long time. I think at least 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, I wrote something called Process is the Product. And the product is solving a problem, right? And the product has users. And then more importantly, the product needs to evolve. A lot of times people create a process, they just create it and they forget it, right? So we call this a process debt. It's like a tech debt. When you have people just add on to the process, never say, okay, these things do not apply anymore. Let's just get rid of it, right? So that's a good part of operations. They maintain their process product. Make sure it still makes sense. Make sure the environment is still there and get rid of process debt. And so that actually makes sense. If you don't, it's bloated, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's really something where, we practice a lot, throughout my journey in product operations, or later on portfolio management, strategic ops. In general, it's like we always just say, okay, we're going to operate this way now because we learned this. Let's adjust our process, get rid of things no longer apply, or you can have like 2 use cases. In this use case, you have the heavy-handed. In this use case, you have a lightweight, so that not everyone are subject to the heavy-handed, because there are, like if I launch a country, they will have offices and all that stuff. You're gonna have a lot of people, you're gonna have this book. But if you like a light launch with some translations and local stuff, it's like a 1 page, 16 checklist. You don't need to subject. You have to say which type, so that this sort of like a process as a product, or ritual, right? So you understand why it is there, what problems it's solving, and it continues to improve it and get rid of the process then.
We're getting a lot of good chatter in the chat around how people love process. So
I wrote a piece about like what I calling product operations, creative destruction, right? And I love that term because there's a lot of times where we have to evolve or break down something before we can just like bring it forward. And so, yeah, I definitely think about, I agree with you. I think there needs to be this ability to break down as well as build up. And those are both sides of the coin of like understanding what is most effective, right?
Right. And that's the same thing as our product, right? So if we build a product over time, it tend to be bloated. You have a feature, the feature never used. So we like the feature adoption. What's the process? Is it apply? How many use cases apply? Can we get rid of it? So if you really take a product mindset, it really solves a lot of the challenges we face today. And that, ultimately, it is, right? Product managers are one of our key customer groups. And the process is just a way to say how we work together. It's to commonly, mutually agree, say this is the best way in most cases. As time goes on, you need someone own it to say, does this still apply? Should we change it? So when you don't have product operation, this is why product operation became a more popular role is because when you have more product managers, they exist in an organization for a long enough time, and everyone would have to interact with each other. There's no agreed upon way of operating. So someone has to do that. If it's not someone else does it in a part-time role, then it's just not gonna get enough attention. So the organizational cost is tremendous, right? We tend to forget. People say, I got burned out. And actually half the people get burned out from work is because of bad process, not because of workload. The bad process, bad tooling, like a double or quadruple sometimes the effort you need to do your real job. Therefore, people get burned out and they couldn't figure out why they're burned out. The reality is we actually tested out, right? So literally people get burned out because they have bad process, bad toolings, people have to spend so much time on considered non-essential work, but it's needed for them to do their work, right? So it's a tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think the calendar audit, like having one of the first things I've been starting to think about is like time management is a huge issue for a lot of product managers because they'll be in meetings from like 9 to 5, and then it's oh, when do I do the deep work that I need to do? And so to your point, right, like doing a calendar audit of your community, I think is something that can be really, really effective, and understanding when you've had to change the way that you make decisions in some significant way due to process. I think you can start to get into this world of like actually understand the true cost of certain processes that are, and then you need to make that trade-off, right? Is it worth being safe in this way for us to have this cost? And if not, then how do we change that?
Or how do you do it?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
You know, so I think, just going back why I started Dragonboat, right? Because I spent my Sunday afternoon to write updates to my 6 different sets of the stakeholders when I see different data. And I spend half my week to do planning and negotiation, all that stuff, and whatever. So ultimately, when you have a tool to automate stuff, then at least you can get rid of stuff and also give you visibility on the problem, just like calendar audit. What if you don't have a calendar? You can't even do an audit, right? But when you have something like a calendar, you say, okay, these are the ineffective things. These are the things we could do it differently. Or maybe we should have group session. Maybe we should use tool. There are a lot of things today we all face. The biggest challenge is how do we collaborate? Collaboration is the biggest challenge in modern world, I believe, because previously the manufacturing world, there's no coordination, right? Just workflow. And today is everyone's dependent on each other. So the collaboration at the different places, from the Scrum teams, cross-functional team, to between PMs and PMs with various levels of organization. So all that is taking a lot, think about the number of notes you have to go through, right? So
I mean, that's why I think the concept of Taylorism is applied to product roles, for example, is bad in some way, because there's no one right way to do something, or there's not a best way to do something, right? There's a lot of ways to do things, and there's ways that will work here based on organizational context, and there are things that will work for our customers, but there's not a one way that you can sign. I don't even think you can have lots of great data. You may not be able to scientifically prove that this process is better over another, because you have things like opportunity costs. You have these things where you make a decision, you can't go back and remake the decision probably because the context is now changed in some way. So I think there's a lot of enabling the art of product management is something that product operations people should be doing as well.
Right. I agree with you. Ultimately, it's almost like a solving. So the challenge we're facing for most of product operations, or actually for product organization, is that you have categories of challenges, right? So one category of the challenge is how product managers get the resources and the tooling and visibility, alignment, data, all that stuff to do their job well, right? The other part is what is the way that the product management can work well with each others and also up and down the chain, right? So when product teams and leadership team, for whatever there's always transition from a strategy goals to initiative to work. That whole transition is a very big part of a complex coordination, and it's changing. So that's a good thing, right? If it's not changing, that's not a good thing, right? So how do you maintain and manage and enable that part of the collaboration, right? So then the third part is the collaboration, not only within product managers themselves, also with the cross-functional teams. Today, we all talk about product-led. If you think about product-led or product-focused company, that means it takes more than just a product management. Obviously, product engineering work very closely, product marketing, product and marketing, product and sales, so product and customer success. All these how do you interact so that, like you said, product managers spend all day having meetings because all the collaboration they have to do with themselves and they go up and down the chain and with all the cross-functional teams. So bring them together to make that easier, streamlined, and that's a big part of enable product managers to do their job, right? The product managers love to solve problems, love to, customers and the market, and not so much of the things moving around.
Yeah, maybe like the right way to think about this is that we're trying to help make the product manager's job like legible enough to other groups, right? Not too legible. Like a lot of what we do is kind of open-ended in some way and negotiated. Right. But making things like a little bit more legible, like the idea of portfolio planning or road mapping or these types of things that start to like, how do we make this more understood as far as like the way we will do our work when needed? And then when are we going to go off and like figure out things?
Right. So that's sort of exactly. So, because ultimately everyone depends on product, right? Yeah. Customer success teams depend on product marketing and everyone sells, right? So therefore it's essential to provide like, you can call it visibility or legible and whatever, right? So people needs to know who's this and where you are and how we progress. So these are the things, can be time consuming. That's we can definitely help to address some of those challenges.